Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bird Brain. Today I have got Scarlett Hilton that's joined me. I am very excited because Scarlett is actually the first person that's reached out to me herself. Firstly, I always like anyone that's really proactive and passionate, so passionate that they can sort of put themselves forward to do something. And secondly, you've given me a much needed little morale boost that my podcast is moving in the right direction. So, Scarlett, huge kudos to you. Thank you so much for joining me. Because other people won't know who you are, do you mind telling me a little bit about yourself and sort of what made you want to get involved with this podcast and makes you want to talk about birds?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I think that this podcast reached me because I'm just such a avid bird watcher, and that's kind of what I tell people first and foremost is that I'm all about birds and bird watching. Um, I was in the BTO's Young Leader program of 2023, which was really incredible, where I devised a poetry workshop for people there based on nature. It was incredible. Currently, I'm working with disabled teenagers and kind of more disadvantaged and vulnerable teenagers within urban areas as London and Oxford, making nature truly accessible. I think it's really, really important that we come together and understand the barriers that close off nature to young people and giving them access to the well-being that nature can provide for them. Yeah.
I think you're tying together two of my favorite things there, language and nature. And for you, do you know which one came first? Was it like a love of poetry or was it a love of nature? Have they always been really interlinked?
Wow, yeah, definitely. I think nature is a huge kind of component of nature. I think particularly in like creative writing and poetry, it's like really, really the fuel behind a lot of the traditional poets, such as like Keats, who's my all-time favorite. But actually, birds have only really found me recently. I used to work up in Tynemouth, up in this old monastery. I used to just do like maintenance work out there and open it up every morning at like 5 a.m. And
Uh-huh.
the sand swallows used to kind of whip past my face. And I didn't actually know that they were sand swallows until I realized, you get on Google, you're like, what are these birds? And then, as I'm sure many bird watchers know, that is a deep rabbit hole that people don't normally come back out of. So I'm kind of new to the world of birds and still finding my feet in the place. But I think that I'm really passionate about making it accessible to everybody. Yeah.
What is one of the key things that you think makes nature more accessible to people, specifically when you're considering people that might not have the ability to have, the financial freedom, the transportation, or the knowledge to really take themselves down that path? What do you think is a big catalyst for making it accessible?
Yeah, I really think it is about those kind of charities and spaces, community spaces within these urban areas that make it accessible. I think a lot of people don't even have that primary knowledge about where to go, what to do in those spaces, how to use those spaces, how those spaces can be really beneficial to young people. So it's really about putting those things together. There's an incredible collective called Flock Together, which is young people of colour within London who get together and just do like shared bird watching trips. And I just think it's absolutely incredible. Things like that
Oh,
are just
that's
really
lovely.
changing the game.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. Okay, well, without any further ado, we should probably introduce the character of the episode and where it's come from. Now, because you spearheaded this choice, I am going to let you tell the listeners the character, the species, and what made you gravitate towards this choice. So,
Oh, I'm
take it
honoured.
away.
So our bird of the episode is Blue from Rio. Um, Blue is a Spix macaw. A lot of people say Sphinx, but it's actually Spix. They are a type of macaw, one of the 18 species of macaw that's found in Central and South America. It follows the kind of story of a bird who was captured by smugglers as a young, I was going to say child, but I should say Um, he's domesticated, lives a kind of very comfortable life, and then has to navigate kind of wild world through lots of dancing, lots of festivities and colours and friendship. And it's just a nice story about navigation of the natural world. Yeah.
I was really glad that you chose this because I hadn't actually watched Rio for a long time. And my brother's fiance is actually Brazilian, and it's really interesting because I've been to Brazil, and but it was a long time ago. And I, like yourself, have come into birding sort of later. I've always been interested in nature and conservation. I've always been quite interested in ecotourism and quite careful about the things I'm doing with animals. And as I've got older, I've also reflected on the things I have engaged with. I've been like, oh, maybe that wasn't the right call, or maybe I wouldn't do that again, and been more sort of vigilant on researching my interactions in the natural world. But Sam, my brother's fiance, has really obviously coloured conversations about Brazil more and really sort of driven it home. And it was really nice to see it through that lens. And I also gave her a little message earlier with a little panic saying, can you please send me a voice note on how I pronounce some of these trees? So we can watch for that later where I can try my pronunciation. But yeah, it's a really nice one because with Rio, the interesting thing is that while it is a typical kids film and it is so vibrant and fun and playful, there's a lot of accuracies in this about the plight of the bird and what happens when a bird is domesticated, but it's not really done in a preachy way. I really like the way they humanize some of the sort of poachers, and they also make you consider the complexity of the reasons why we don't live harmoniously in our environments when there's a lot of poverty. So, there's a lot of social issues in this film alongside the conservation message. And I really, really like that. I think there's a lot to get our teeth into. I guess the first thing I should probably ask you is a very standard question. How well do you think Rio did the representation of the Spix macaw?
I think it was pretty spot on. I think it's pretty amazing. I really like your kind of interpretation of the humanization of the smugglers. I'm really excited to get into that as well. But I think in terms of the Spix macaw behavior, the plight, it really, really gets into it. I mean, this movie helped really kind of put into the forefront this bird. It went kind of viral. I don't know if you were like on Instagram at that time, but all these kind of, did you know that the bird from Rio, that is truly extinct? I mean, it's probably been extinct in the wild since about 2000,
Yeah.
um, officially 2018, but it really helped kind of build that momentum into what the illegal pet trade and smuggling is doing to these birds. I thought it was an incredible bit of media that really helped us launch that conversation.
It's something I really enjoy when pop culture takes things the right way because you can't plan for that. Because obviously, the writers, the creators, it doesn't matter what their intentions are. Once something goes into the wild, if you like, it takes on its own meaning. Like, it's interesting, especially when you think about macaws in general. They have quite frequently been a status symbol within pop culture to wealthy people. When I was doing research into this, I was looking at how Mick Jagger gifted his daughter a macaw. Mike Tyson famously had a pet macaw as well. And for those of you that don't know who that was the world heavyweight boxing champion. He was widely known for owning a whole range of exotic pets, famously tigers. But he had a macaw, a blue and gold one. Is interesting because he actually said that he thinks that the parrot was potentially his favorite of all his pets, but especially of his birds. It would greet him verbally, and he thought it was the smartest animal that he owned. But as is the kind of tends to be the arc within pop culture, viewing anything as something you can consume does not really give it agency, which is okay when it is not alive, but when it isn't, it's a problem because regardless of how much he valued that creature and, maybe sang about the virtues of it and how much that might have inspired some people to respect the species, he himself had to sell his macaw during a bankruptcy period in the early 2000s. He had to give away many of his pets to settle debts. There's something particularly cruel about taking somebody's pets away from them, I think. But I also think it tells you how, you know, it's a lifelong endeavor to have a pet, and getting an exotic pet is an expensive thing, and it's something that involves a lot of research that maybe people don't undertake, you know.
I think it's so something to be said about kind of the fatal flaw of these macaws is that they're both incredibly social, but that kind of makes it so they're easy to domesticate and we connect bonds with them and it's their kind of yeah it's their Achilles heel. It's why we revere them so much, but it really puts them in trouble. I think humans have such a strange tendency to want to kind of own something that's so beautiful, kind of put their flag in a land or own something, and it is really detrimental.
Yeah, I find it really difficult. One of my friends talks a lot about whether he thinks it's moral to own pets in any way at all. Um, I mean, I've actually owned an exotic pet twice. So I had a African pygmy hedgehog twice, but in my defense, I got them from a rescue specifically after doing some research into how many are abandoned here, because they're a terrible pet. I mean, they're really cute, but they prickle.
Yeah,
They're nocturnal.
not cuddly,
They,
then soft. Yeah,
yeah, and like also, I think this is the social media thing. There's loads of those. Like, there's a hedgehogs wearing hats account, and they look adorable with their little knitted hats on and in their little scenes, and they will do those things, but that requires a lot of handling and taming. And while a hedgehog is quite happy to live in, in a solitary existence, they want to run like 8 miles a night. So, my hedgehogs had a wheel that they would run on for their health, but they will poo on that wheel all night long. Their
and keep
feet
you awake. Yeah.
covered in poo, and they'll get poo in their spikes, and you need to clean them. And there's, I rehomed them feeling very, very sad that so many of these creatures have been bred or taken from, the natural environment and left to sort of languish in a cage for its whole life because they become too much effort to play with. But it made me think a lot about the exotic pet trade, and it's really, really sad. In relation to macaws, you've already mentioned that their intelligence is a reason, but why do you think they have been so heavily targeted by smugglers?
Yeah, there's this kind of strange status symbol that exists amongst the buyers, where if something is really rare and it's illegal to poach it and own it, it becomes this real status symbol, and it's really revered thing that will actually get a lot of buyers to back smugglers with a lot of money. So there's this massive push from the buyers to kind of equip the smugglers with technologies and that incentive. So it's really difficult. Obviously, the nature of the Spix's macaw is that they are so sweet and they're actually a lot quieter than other macaws, and their color and their rarity, um, which for the aviaries, people that own aviaries is a huge plus. But
I was looking into that as well because we've mentioned that it was considered extinct for a while. But I was thinking why this one more than others. And that point, it was actually natively sometimes considered to be the ghost bird. That's what they call the Spix macaw because it was so rare and so quiet compared to the other noisy macaws. In fact, I thought it was fascinating. Many native people to the areas where it would have been found, like the caatinga, believed it was extinct decades before it officially was, which I thought was really fascinating. Do you know anything else about the vocalizations of this bird or macaws in general that you think are interesting?
absolutely, the vocalizations are incredibly important to these birds, macaws in general. They're incredibly complex and actually build languages, and I like to say like accents. So like different flocks will kind of have different accents based on what they're talking about because they wouldn't be able to understand it. And I think that's a really good kind of tie into the movie and the characters that Blue is trying to kind of navigate this other world, and Jewel, the other kind of bird, is essentially speaking a different language. Um, so we see within these flocks and pairs these distinct languages and these distinct vocalizations come up that other flocks might not understand, but it's imperative to their what they've encountered, their memories with threats, their memories with food and with each other is really important socially.
So, touching on that, you've mentioned the fact that Jewel had been a wild Spix macaw.
Mm,
And then obviously Blue, our protagonist, Blue had been poached from a baby, so had never really grown up in the wild, very heavily domesticated. I also really like it. Blue was domesticated in a place called Moose Lake, Minnesota, so taken to sort of this very cold, different environment to the one it would have been in. And I'm wondering, does the film accurately reflect the fact that lack of wild parents is going to affect a reintroduction of a Sphinx because it won't have learned the behaviors,
mm.
including vocalizations that allow it to communicate and therefore find a mate?
Absolutely. I think even Blue's kind of inability to dance and fly is really a poignant message into like how important those behaviors are. Spix's recall actually demonstrate what's called automatic imitation intransitive actions. That's a big old word.
Yeah.
Which is basically goalless action. So you're doing it simply for the fun of it. There's no kind of reward of food or anything, and it's something that we see in humans only. So in human anthropology, we use it to develop social connections, but we also use it to develop entire cultures. Those behaviors become a kind of, yeah, poster of our cultures. So it's really, really important that these birds have almost like a heritage and a family
Yeah.
line that is being wiped out by these smugglers. Because then when we introduce three random birds from across the jungle together, and it is really difficult to reintroduce that and to teach them those behaviors because rewilding is such a mess. And yeah,
Yeah.
you need your mum and dad, and you need your culture.
It's really great when you can talk about something that a film has done right, especially when it's for children, because I know that it takes a lot of research to do these things justice. And like you've mentioned, it really has covered quite a lot of themes there, considering the fact that Blue doesn't know how to interact properly, hasn't got the vocalizations, hasn't got the flight ability, doesn't have the natural instincts it should have because it hasn't been socialized accurately to its environment. Something the film did not get right, and did you spot it? The environment that it's set in. So, obviously, the Amazon is in Brazil. So, first off, they did well there. However, you would not have been finding a Spix macaw in the Amazon. So, it's not a jungle bird like they were presenting it in the film. I understand why they went for that choice for the shorthand of when people think of Brazil, they think of rainforest. And they had so many other messages they kind of wanted to push. Maybe they didn't want to distract people by showing them a more accurate environment. But I thought that was really interesting because essentially the Spix macaw is a endemic species to the caatinga, and that is a very, very different environment to the Amazon rainforest. Do you know much about the caatinga, or is it something you'd be interested in?
So the Spix's macaw, interestingly enough, is actually named after Ritter von Spix, who was a zoologist. He spent 4 years in Brazil. He actually covered 620 miles across that area on foot.
Wow.
Yes,
On foot.
yes, on foot. Can you believe it? A
Oh, what a
true
life.
explorer. And he actually caught a macaw, what we thought was a kind of Galapagos macaw. But after his death, and once it was kind of in back at the museums in London, they kind of took a better look, and it was actually a brand new species they hadn't identified before. And
Wow.
thus now we have the Spix macaw after Ritter von Spix. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting.
He
Oh,
found in that area up there in northeasterly part, which is actually a bit more not like a desert, but it's a little bit more arid. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what I was thinking. It's interesting because the caatinga, which, that biome itself covers about 11% of Brazil. So it's huge in its own right. But it is sort of a unique semi-arid region. It's home to diverse flora and fauna, but it is one of the country's most threatened biomes. I was
Mm,
looking into this, and basically over 45% of its native vegetation has been lost due to deforestation and degradation of land. But it isn't that sort of luscious rainforest. It is semi-arid. It would be exceptionally dry. And that with itself brings in one of the other huge issues that the Spix is facing. It is the loss of one of the trees that should be rife in that environment, which is the carabera tree. Which is not just like a perch for the macaw. It's basically a cornerstone for their survival. I kind of like to think about this tree as being the home, restaurant, and the entire neighborhood for the Spix macaw, all rolled into one.
yeah.
Because these trees, they develop natural cavities that are suitable for the macaw to like lay its eggs and rear their young in it.
Mhm.
So obviously, scarcity of those trees are directly limiting available nesting sites. And then it produces seed pods that are a primary food source for the Spix macaw. I thought that one of the most fascinating things I read while doing my research for this was that during some of the recent reintroduction efforts, captive bred Spix macaws instinctively recognized and consumed these seeds, despite the fact they'd never encountered them before. There's been quite a lot of observations from conservation projects in Brazil on this topic. I was looking at information from the Association for the Conservation of Threatened Parrots, abbreviated to ACTP, and the Brazilian Chico Mendes Institute for Biodiversity Conservation, which is the ICM Bio. And I thought that that was fascinating. Like they instinctively know that that is a good source of food for them. So without those, they're obviously
Yeah.
really struggling.
No, it's a really, really like lifeline of them. They have a really symbiotic relationship with these trees as well for like seed dispersal and forest regeneration. They are pretty much the biggest thing you will see out there. Um, if out in that kind of arid land, they're incredible. And like you say, they use them for perches, for raptor like identification, nesting, feeding. It's yeah, it's the hub, it's their everything, it's their village square. It's really important for socialization as well. It's kind of like their meeting point. It's where the flock kind of come together. Although they're in pairs, it is their central hub. And without the Spix, this tree cannot recover because
Yeah.
those seeds dispersal is really the only way that it can get back human activity and or human efforts to reintroduce it. You cannot have that 24-hour round the clock efforts, which the Spix essentially do.
Yeah, and I think as well, we hear a lot about deforestation and rightly so, but it's been interesting in the last, I'd say, 10 years, but in the last five, it's really come to the forefront where we are challenging more those unsustainable agricultural practices as well. But that is a really tricky conversation because you don't want to be punitive towards communities that are relying on practices to provide them a living. And you don't want to be sanctimonious about that. But I was looking at what's affected the caatinga biome apart from deforestation. And it was that cattle ranching and the cotton plantations, which again is back to that arid environment. And these activities basically, obviously, they cleared vast tracts of land, but it's that soil degradation that impacts when these things are happening, when we're rinsing and repeating them on the land. And it leads to, and this, I love this word, but it's very hard to say, desertification, because I always want to say desert, which tells you a lot about how I always think with my belly. But yeah, the desertification of the land, which obviously has been benefiting these large agribusinesses, but at the expense of local ecosystems. But like you mentioned at the start, it's not all doom and gloom because Brazil has, despite a lot of political turmoil, it has been trying to promote restoration efforts and especially ones that emphasize community involvement. So, for instance, like in northeastern Brazil, there is agrocaatinga, which is a model that has proven to be effective, where previously degraded lands are now producing around sort of 50 types of food. So they're trying to combine agroforestry systems with rainwater harvesting techniques. And these initiatives are getting funded from the government itself. So, as recently as, a couple of weeks ago, the Brazilian government launched the second Eco Invest auction, which solely aims to restore 1 million hectares of degraded lands across multiple biomes. And you've also got the Brazilian Restoration and Bioeconomy Finance Coalition, which was established to mobilize $10 billion for forest conservation and bioeconomy by 2030. I think it's nice when you see that they've recognized that these things are time sensitive and they're not putting sort of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. They're trying to get that going now, because these restoration projects not only aim to obviously revive the ecosystems, but also to improve the livelihoods of the local communities. And we really need to integrate those sustainable practices. I've mentioned agroforestry, but there's also things like beekeeping. Residents can achieve this economic stability while contributing to environmental conservation. But obviously, reviving a landscape like the caatinga is a multifaceted endeavor. You've really got to intertwine that ecological restoration with social and economic development. You can't preserve our planet's biodiversity without thinking about how interconnected we are and without wanting to maintain that interconnectedness.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really is those kind of single fauna like spaces where it's like the sugarcane plantations where it's totally bulldozing the biodiversity, which is so difficult to restore. And it's really all about spearheading the community knowledge. I think once we identify the local people that are profiting off these things, and rightfully so, that is their livelihood. It's just about giving them the tools and the knowledge that they need to kind of save this space, which is so integral to the fragile ecosystem and the balance systems that exist there. There's also a kind of technique, I don't actually know what it's called, but when they have those single kind of plantations with the sugarcane, is
Yeah.
planting kind of another one in between the rows,
Yeah.
to add some sort of diversity to it, which really, really helps the soil and can even help that. But even in these plantations, we do see the macaws trying to adapt to them. And then a lot of the time, the residents and the workers see them as pests. So
Mhm.
it's a difficult relationship that it is all about kind of education and yeah.
Yeah. I think I think it's called agroforestry
Mm,
when you integrate a wider variety of species. So in the Caatinga, that degraded land I was talking about, they've basically they've done the integrating native trees, like the arera, the angico, and the umbu, but they've put those alongside crops and fruit bearing plants, hoping that these systems will stabilize the soil, um, and obviously provide income at the same time. And the benefits don't stop from just getting the income. The idea is that that multi-layered environment should support wildlife because obviously if you improve the soil quality and you can sustain a variety of plants, you will allow a variety of wildlife to thrive. And I was looking at what you kind of have to consider practically for that. So the reason they've chosen trees like the Angico and the Arera is to attract those nectar feeding birds and the pollinators like the bees and the bats. And then you've obviously got the small mammals like the agoutis and the armadillos. They thrive in diverse habitats. They can't just be there trying to live. If you sort of replant just one tree in an area, you're not going to attract these things that need diversity. Hummingbirds, for example, they might want the nectar of certain flowers from certain trees, but if you don't have enough shade in an area, you're not going to attract them there either. So we really need to be considering our wildlife corridors whenever we are improving an area to allow sort of those roaming, migrating birds and roaming animals to want to pass through, which is really hard if it's a uniform environment. I mean, I don't think we would really want to be in an environment where everything is absolutely exactly the same either.
Exactly. It's all about kind of promoting that natural regeneration that they know best. It truly
Yeah.
is such a fragile, particularly within these like really unique like microbiomes, like, even in the Amazon, it's just this really fragile tipping of the scales that's been in such an amazing equilibrium for years and years. And one thing can kind of destabilize the entire thing. So it's about in ways we can kind of letting it do its thing. And I think there is something to be said by like over analyzing and over protecting. And like it really is about kind of like rewilding truly, not over preening and not over analyzing it. Yeah.
I like that idea. Considering the film, did you have a favorite part? Was there anything about Blue's character that you particularly liked?
I think just his character is really spot on to kind of what macaws are. He's kind of bashful and shy and sweet and funny. A lot of macaws can actually blush. The skin around their beak and their face is actually it lacks feathers, so you can kind of see the capillaries come through it. So when they're excited or their favorite friend is there, they can actually blush a little bit, and um, they're just quite sweet. They're quite sweet animals, which I think Blue is. I always like to think of them as old Victorian women, kind of
Yeah.
swinging and fanning their feathers and like resting, taking midday rests. And
Yeah.
although Blue is a bit more kind of out there with that, but I like to think of them as that. Yeah.
I love that image. That's a great one. Swooning.
Yes.
Um,
No. Just I'll put like, in the balls like, oh, I couldn't bear another dance. It's so difficult.
yeah. Oh, that's lovely. I really like that image. That's going to stay with me. Um, okay, so we like Blue, we like Rio, we think that it does a lot of things that it's meant to do. Let's go for a philosophical question. If a bird is extinct in the wild, right? So take our Spix macaw, which obviously we thought was extinct. If a bird is extinct in the wild, but it's abundant in captivity, do you think it has really been saved? And do you think it's better to have it in captivity than not at all?
Yeah, speaking like philosophically, it's the
Mm.
body, the animal is there, but the purpose it's meant to serve, what it's meant to do, what it's meant to be as the animal is not happening. Which is kind of like there's that missing puzzle piece out where it's supposed to be. So saved, we're not sure. It's not been restored to its place. From captive species, we can make incredible efforts to restore that and its purpose. But otherwise, I don't think so. I don't think it is truly saved. No.
No, I feel the same because if it cannot survive where it's meant to survive, or if it cannot survive without human intervention, it's in my mind it's protected but not saved,
Mm,
you know.
mm.
Because I just think, and maybe this is a simplistic way of thinking about it, but I think if I couldn't live without the consistent support of others, that it's a beautiful thing for people to protect others. But I wouldn't consider myself free.
Mm.
Um, and I would consider myself protected. And, you know, while that's important, I don't think protected is the same as liberated if you can't thrive in your own environment.
Yeah, I think about quite holistically about where they're meant to be and what
Hmm.
they're meant to be doing. And I think that there is a space there without them that is really missing an integral part. Not only for the purpose they might serve for the larger environment and kind of biodiversity around them, but like almost for them. I think we tend to humanize, and I actually try not humanize animals because I think it's
Mhm.
quite dangerous. But like in terms of like they're meant to be somewhere else, and their body calls to somewhere else. Like you say, even the captive ones recognize those trees as their home and their food, and there is this instinct and innate call within them that's meant to be somebody somewhere else. And behind those cages and kind of gawked at and collected and traded, it's totally devoiding what is beautiful about these birds is that they're
Yeah.
naturally occurring like miracles. Like the way that they look and the way that they act is so unique. And yeah, we just have that real damned human thing of like wanting to hold that and own that, which is really annoying.
Yeah. I found it absolutely wild looking into the kind of famous people that had owned macaws. And obviously, I've mentioned Jagger and Tyson, and now we're coming to the big one. I did not know about this at all, which I'm actually surprised about because this is a kind of quirky thing that would be right up my street to know about, but seems to have passed me by. So, Pablo Escobar, obviously the infamous Colombian drug lord, he actually had a private zoo. So it was called the Hacienda Napoli. He owned that sort of in the 1980s. That had macaws in it, as well as elephants, giraffes, zebras, and hippos. But when he died in 93, loads of those animals were just abandoned. This is coming full circle to what we touched on earlier. If you commodify something, it doesn't mean that everybody understands the commodity because
Mm.
it isn't a commodity, you know? And if they didn't know what to do with them, or the amount of effort, time, and finance it would have taken to look after the zoo probably became a lower priority. And basically, they were abandoned and many of them were left to roam. The hippos became completely feral and overtook the area, you know, and obviously hippos are quite dangerous. Um,
Yeah.
they made loads of headlines, but there were loads of local reports as well about the feral macaws and the parrots who just stayed around the estate. Um, but the birds, unlike the hippos, did integrate into the local bird populations. I think animal rescue groups did try to collect some of them, but they'd fended for themselves for years in the wild. And I think that tells you a lot about macaws because obviously, famously, things like budgies, canaries, a lot of them don't survive very well. If they've been domesticated for a long time, they would struggle and they obviously hunted quite easily. Whereas the macaws were managing to sort of reintegrate themselves. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting that Pablo Escobar was out there collecting animals and making himself a zoo.
Oh, yeah, they're totally status symbols. We see it everywhere. I think in the Middle East right now, it's a real kind of issue. Not only macaws, but falcons as well. It's a huge
No.
status symbol within those circles to own these falcons and macaws. It gets you points. It gets you points in your circles. But yeah,
Yeah, and even, I love Salvador Dali's work. I'm a massive fan of his surrealist work, but he also had an entire macaw phase. Like he basically loved how they defied normal dimensions. So I guess it's those massive tail feathers and maybe the vivid colors that suited his surreal taste palette, right? But he was painting them in the 50s and 60s quite a lot. But he was actually photographed walking a macaw on a leash in Paris as part of a performance art stunt. And I was thinking about how incongruous that would have looked, like a macaw walking down a crowded street in Paris. And I can imagine everybody with their cigarettes and the newspaper hustle and bustle, and then, him with a macaw. But I don't think having it as a status symbol is the same as appreciating it for what it is
yeah.
it? It's not the same.
It's not. I think having a pet, having a pair as pets, although I don't agree with, there can be cases where there are bonds and they live a good life, but it's really when it comes to these kind of itemization or commodification of it, when you're using it as a prop or I mean, some of these collectors have hundreds and hundreds in these aviaries. Again, we see in lots of places in the Middle East these massive indoor enclosures, just hundreds. And some of those are some of the last kind of individuals of their species, and they exist only in these private aviaries, which haven't got the kind of public backing. It went in the 80s. I mean, we know we're talking about the 60s, but in the 80s, it kind of went like wildfire and it was totally unregulated and the
Yeah.
fallouts from that were unbelievable.
hmm I was even looking at the modern day stuff though. So in the UK, I tried to, I sort of went down a rabbit hole about regulation.
Mm.
So I read a study called On the Record, an analysis of exotic pet licenses in the UK. And I was sort of looking through PubMed Central to get that sort of journal. And, they were looking at 2019 and basically out of 1,192 pet shop licenses, 55% of those included permission to sell birds, but only sort of they don't all list what they're going to sell. So 123 of them mention parrots, parakeets, and macaws specifically. But, you know, despite the fact that we have regulations in place here, there were 95 pet traders in England that were given a 1-star rating, indicating that there's literally minor failings in animal welfare, you know, in 2019. And that's quite a lot, 95 different traders. Um, and then if you looked at the numbers, I, you know, I didn't know what I thought it would be, but in a 5-year span, what kind of number would have you gone for how many live wild animals were imported into the UK for commercial purposes?
Well, I know that even in one year, it worldwide, the hyacinth macaw, there were 10,000 individuals smuggled out of their natural habitat, which is unbelievable numbers in a
10,000.
single year. Um, so that's just one species. You cannot even imagine, those kind of really popular ones like the scarlet macaw and the green
Yeah.
macaw. The numbers are incredible. I mean, within regulation and policy, we've always been 10 years behind, 20 years behind.
hmm
Lag on every single step from the policy on the ground of like in these spaces, in this forest, in these lands, to government, to handling, to smuggling, to the buyers, to the sellers. In
Yeah.
every single part of this chain, the
Yeah.
policy's always been so behind, so lacking, far too late. We take action just as it's about to go extinct. We don't identify the problem before that. And to be honest, it is because these smugglers are so advanced. Their technologies are weirdly incredible. You find yourself like in the movie, almost understanding them and maybe rooting them for them a little bit sometimes, even though you're not meant to. It's an Indiana Jones kind of tale. Yeah.
I'm interested in this. I'm gonna say the number of birds that we kind of had just in the UK, and you've already touched on the global number. So between that 2014 and 18 period, we were looking at, logged the importing of 100,000 birds just into the UK. 100,000 birds being imported in for commercial purposes, and they're the registered ones. You've obviously touched on the global number. Now, I'm pretty sure that a lot of those will have been also poached, illegally captured in the first place. What kind of technologies are they using?
It's really unbelievable. I mean, a lot of them, particularly for the macaws that reside on rock faces, they are getting illegal planes, helicopters, and they're dropping in. on these rock faces and stealing particularly eggs. That's what's really, really valuable is
Right.
unhatched eggs, because then these buyers and these kind of aviary owners can say that it was born in captivity and kind of sneak past those loopholes. So that's the
Yeah.
kind of the most valuable thing. What we really find as well is these smugglers are hacking into these databases. So
Mhm.
obviously we are trying to reintroduce some of these macaws into the wild, and we're making artificial nests in these trees, and we have the locations of these nests. Um, these smugglers are really advanced data hackers and can look at the database and know exactly where these artificial nests are, and they will target them. They will bribe landowners, and they will make sure they get the cargo, because each one can go for, I mean, a Spix macaw, one individual can get you £12,000.
Thing is, it's life-changing money.
It is. It is. And for these people who have no other option and they have that native kind of knowledge of where they are, their behavior, and they have a network of sellers
Yeah.
backing them, it's you cannot blame them, or I'm careful to blame, because really
Mm.
what the problem is, it lies in the attitude of the buyers.
Yeah.
Why are we making It lies in the attitude of these buyers, because why are we seeing these incredible animals as something to own and something to snatch from its natural habitat?
And in the film, I think this is something that Rio does quite well. There is that moment between the smugglers because there's a young boy who, it, essentially is the one that brings Blue and Jewel to the smuggling network. And he does ask what's going to happen to them. And he does have this assumption, well, they're going to go to a home, they're going to be cared for. And I do understand that idea of if somebody is willing to pay so much money for something, if they're willing to equip you with technology, if they're willing to sort of be a responsive buyer, it is very easy because we're disconnected from the result. It is very easy to assume that this bird is going to have a great life. So why would you not capitalize? And it's very easy to say, oh, for the moral reason. And it's like, well, it's easy to have morals when you have money as well, though. Like I'm always careful not to make sweeping statements about, because there's that inherent idea of othering when we talk about the type of people or the type of places where smuggling's occurring, like, and I think it's interesting that that othering creates this idea that in our own countries, everything is in place so that those things don't happen. And it's just the sort of bad eggs that receive those goods, but they're in a minority. But actually, there is not a massive distinction in rules on whether they're followed, which obviously is why this can perpetuate. So I was looking into Minnesota because that's where Blue ends up for a while, and I enjoyed having a little search at what's going on in Minnesota. And there is like a state law. There's a statute, and it's called 346.155 that explicitly prohibits the possession of exotic cats, bears, non-human primates, and any hybrids with domestic animals, right? So that law is aiming to protect both the public and also promote animal welfare. But look, I'd argue that if the focus is on ownership, but not purchase being forbidden, well, there's clearly a massive loophole that's open for people to continue to exploit and profit from exotic creatures. You just mentioned it. That's why people want the eggs. But if you didn't have the loopholes, they couldn't have the eggs. So loads of species also in Minnesota currently like live in a legal gray area. If you think about what they've named, exotic cats, bears, non-human primates, and hybrids, it literally means that alligators are technically legal statewide to own in the whole of Minnesota, but they have been forbidden in Minneapolis. But then a capybara has a blanket ban on it across the whole of Minnesota. And I think that it's really good to notice that if we really wanted a loophole to close, we could just close it. If we wanted to stop this whole rigmarole, you would make your laws tighter as well. And I also found it really fascinating, on a slight tangent, but this really made me smile. On this website for, environmental literacy in Minnesota to make these laws kind of clearer, one of the questions is, can I own a penguin in Minnesota? And it's like, no, all species of penguins are protected. But straight away, there's this loophole there because it's like you would only obtain one legally from a zoo that has bred it. And while I know that a zoo is very unlikely to start selling a penguin to, any old Joe Soap that wants one, why is the loophole there?
Mm,
Do you know what I
absolutely.
mean?
Absolutely. And I think it's also to be said that even the question being asked, can I own a penguin? The
Yeah,
public
in
will
Minnesota.
always want to own these kind of illegal exotic things. There will always be an attitude of ownership this. And so I think the loopholes exist there because it will always happen and it's always going to be profitable.
Mm.
It's really about starting conversation of really making it truly, truly illegal. So these people cannot end up in their own hands, in their own home, having these pets that shouldn't be there. Um, and it really all starts from that. And you do see actually a very interesting movement which happens when a new ban is placed on, in this case, a particular bird.
Yeah.
You see the profits of that bird, the profitability of that bird skyrocket. The
Oh.
the kind of conversations then to own it for these kind of wealthy bird owners become it's the must have thing. It's the hot thing to have, which is a really, really difficult attitude to kind of
Yeah.
start to break down and to, yeah.
I always try and find some of the exciting things that are going on because obviously nature is really struggling and it can be really difficult because I like the pop culture tie-ins because obviously they normally have a happy ending. There's normally something to celebrate. There's normally the fact that, like you said, just bringing attention to the species by default can support. But sometimes the situation's a bit bleak. But I've been really interested in looking into how we're trying to keep an eye on finding rare birds in general. Like how do we monitor them for conservation? So I was looking into things outside of obviously tagging them and ringing them. So I was looking into bioacoustic monitoring, and it's not something I've discussed on the podcast before. Is it something you've seen or been involved in or know much about?
Yeah, this type of monitoring is really, really life changing. It's incredible. We can collect large volumes of data. It's kind of like having a live-in ornithologist 24/7 with these
Nice.
visitors. So you don't have to pay human labor, but it's really amazing. It collects obviously audios from these spaces. It's really amazing for finding information on more cryptic animals, perhaps maybe ones that are nocturnal. They have really distinct things, so we can get really incredible data. It's almost like collective data, like you see at Cornell Institution, where we
Yeah.
gather all these vocalizations and we can start to understand what it might mean. But one of the downfalls of this kind of monitoring system is that we cannot understand the context of the vocalizations, which particularly in macaws is really important because we need to know why they made that vocalization, when, with who, because their
Okay.
social systems are so complex and they have these, like we say, these cultures. We
Hmm.
can hear them, but why are they saying that? How have they said that? Is there a threat or are they saying hi to somebody? Over time, we can start to develop that with more data samples. But yeah, those type of things are really important, and particularly for conservation, understanding when they're making those vocalizations are really important for rewilding efforts.
Because in my mind, I was like, oh, setting up a microphone in the wild and it recording 24/7, that sounds like hard work. Because obviously it's really sensitive and it can record everything. Like the calls are what we want, obviously, but it's also getting the wing flaps, the rustling of the trees. Um, and this is where modern technology is fascinating, though, isn't it? Because the computer programs are obviously looking for those specific sound patterns and sifting those things. And it can look through thousands of hours of audio for matches. But I really like this idea that um, you can, what, like why was it useful? And you've obviously got the fact that it's finding them, finding that birds exist in the first place, but also where they are. And you can track a movement. If you've got multiple recorders, then I guess you've got researchers tracking that bird's travel, or even if it's not that individual bird, you've got an idea that the species is maybe, are they effectively using a green corridor? How far are they roaming for food? Because obviously, in a Spix macaw example, there aren't that many of them. So even if you're not sure which one it is, you should start to be able to tell the range of it when it's looking for food, which is nice. And I like this idea that in general, what sounds like a faff, having so many different sounds recorded at once, it actually measures the health of a forest. Because obviously, if you hear lots of different bird calls, then that's positive. But in a damaged area with soil degradation, or if it's highly poached, it will go eerily quiet, and scientists can monitor the soundscape to measure the entire ecosystem without disturbing the wildlife themselves, which I thought was really lovely and not something I'd considered before.
Absolutely. It's really done a lot of wonders for understanding a density of a place. So kind of how biodiverse and how dense within like particular species it is. You've seen a couple of studies about how quickly does a call get a response, or if it gets a response at all. So if, someone's shouting out, a bird is shouting out to its mates, can we hear another individual? How quickly?
Mm.
How far away is it? And that can really help us understand and estimate populations and densities. Yeah.
Oh, it's just lovely. We're obviously going to be finishing off soon, so I'm just wondering, is there anything that you think that you would like listeners to know about the Spix Macaw? Or have you got a little call to action? Is there anything that you think, I want to plug this, whether it's a book, it's a podcast, it's somebody that you follow? What do you want people to know or consider?
I think that what I want people to know and consider is the source. I think attitudes of ownership need to change. I think although we can put in place policies to stop smugglers and we can make purchasing illegal, I think it really, really has to start from the people who want to own these birds. And why do you want to own this bird? I think that that's the really source material. Joshua Hammer, an incredible author, wrote a book called The Falcon Thief. And although it's not on macaws, it's a very similar trade. It's an amazing read. I recommend it to anyone,
I
but
don't know it.
it's really, really good. But the trouble with it is, and what really gets you is you find yourself rooting for the smuggler because
Oh,
it's like a heist movie. It's like Indiana Jones, and each time there's a new law put in place, um, he gets more money to upskill his technology. So he gets night vision glasses, and he gets an ATV, and he gets a plane, and it's this. There is this war, and it's an insight to this war of increasingly upskilled governments and increasingly upskilled smugglers. What's fueling this upskilling is the want of these precious birds.
yeah.
Without that, this war would not happen. And I think it's about putting into the community really good resources on how precious these birds are, how endangered they are, and how vital they are in their natural habitats.
And do you think Rio did a good job of bringing that conversation forward?
I think so. We all know the name. A
Yeah.
lot of us know the actual scientific name,
Mhm.
and they know their journey. I think that there were a lot of donations and a lot of eyes on it. I think virality can be, on go in two ways, and I really think that the impact of this movie has been really incredible for the species. There's been efforts in the last 2 years to reintroduce them. Brazil and Germany have kind of collaborated on a project, and there's been up to about 50 very secret top location efforts there, but they're doing well, and we have high hopes that we'll see them dancing in the wild again.
Yeah, and I think that this is the thing, it is nice because Rio, we focus on Rio obviously because it's the first time that we see blue, but there's been an entire series since that, multiple films, other series, and it is pushing that conversation further. And I think that's really satisfying to have that and be able to look at that arc that we weren't really talking about it, or some people talking about it, but it wasn't in the wider public consciousness. And now I'm not saying it's directly from that, but it definitely has helped, which is lovely. Mm.
Absolutely, it is. It is.
Oh, Scarlett, thank you so much for being my guest today. It's been really, really lovely to have you on Bird Brain.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Elliot explains. When does a teacher carry birdseed?
When?
When there's a parrot teacher conference. Elliot explains.